Pointing into the Atlantic with the seas and oceans beyond, Cornwall has traded with the world since prehistory. Cornish communities are now present on every inhabited continent.
The inhabitants of Britain who dwell about the promontory known as Belerium are especially hospitable to strangers and have adopted a civilized manner of life because of their intercourse with merchants of other peoples. They it is who work the tin. Merchants purchase the tin of the natives and carry it from there across the Straits of Gaul, and, making their way through Gaul for some 30 days, bring their wares to the mouth of the river Rhone, and whence to Rome.
The Roman geographer Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century AD. Throughout history, commerce has been crucial to Cornwall. Professor Philip Peyton of the Institute of Cornish Studies.
Through legend, there is this remembrance of links with trade with the Mediterranean going back to earliest times. Certainly the Romans, who did leave documentary evidence, do talk about trade with Cornwall from the Mediterranean area. And their interest was in tin, of course, because Cornwall was one of the early most productive sources of tin, which became increasingly of use to the Romans and indeed to other Mediterranean and other European peoples during that early period. But more than that, of course, if you look at a map, Cornwall sticks out into the Celtic Sea, as it's often called. There it is on the western approaches with Iberia and Brittany and France down to the south and the southwest, Ireland across to the northwest, and then further up towards Man and Scotland, and of course Wales not that far away across the sea as well. So Cornwall very much in the centre of a trading area, a natural landfall for traders, for travellers, for pilgrims, of course. And in amongst all that, as I said, there is the central importance of tin.
And this, of course, this trading importance went into medieval and historic times.
Yes, it did, yes. Trade has always been part of Cornwall's activity. I mean, if talking not only into the medieval period when shipbuilding and ship owning and ship trading was an important part of the Cornish economy, again with tin, and then into the early modern period and the modern period with, for example, pilchers going to the Mediterranean, and of course in the era of industrialisation, Cornish beam engines to pump and wind from mines went from Cornish foundries all over the world, to Mexico, to South Australia, to South Africa and so on.
I've been a sailor since me birth,
yo ho ho and a ruddy bum bum,
and it took me ship for all it's worth,
yo ho ho and a ruddy bum bum. Lime, scurvy and a grease and marmalade, hoist up the tar devil all the way the bully boys. Lime, scurvy and a grease and blubber, and we're bound for Cincinnati.
Falmouth has always been one of Cornwall's most significant trading ports, and, as Tony Paulin, head of the Bartlett Library at the National Maritime Museum, explains, the packet ships were particularly important.
They were essentially carriers of the Royal Mail. They were dispatch vessels, if you like, but having started off carrying the Royal Mail, which was purely the King's correspondence, his dispatches to his courtiers wherever they were in the world, diplomatic, it then became commercial mail. The merchants latched onto it. The Crown realised it could get a subsidy by people paying to help keep running these ships. But they're expensive ships to run. They're not big ships, about 80 foot long, something the size of some of the modern trawlers you see around the coast there.
You get the impression that there were some very large ships sailing from Cornish ports.
There were towards the end of the sailing era when Falmouth was the port of call for orders. That is, ships coming back from abroad had been away for maybe 6 to 9 months at a time. They got a cargo full of grain usually, but maybe rice, maybe some other commodity. The captains didn't know where was the best market to land this cargo, so they'd call into Falmouth, send a message to their owners wherever they were in the British Isles. They would send back the orders to the captain to take your cargo to Liverpool, Rotterdam, wherever it was. So these were the big last of the grain sailing ships, mainly coming up from Australia in the 1920s, 1930s, and they were big ships.
And of course, trade in and around the coasts of Cornwall has not always been perhaps fair, perhaps not even legal.
Well, the Cornish would have certainly called it fair trade, but fair in inverted commas. Free trade as well, because they didn't like to pay the duties. So yes, smuggling was a major part of Cornish economy in some eras.
The main smuggled goods, what would they have been?
Now, the main smuggled goods, of course, this is brandy, rum and Geneva, or gin. There were also a certain amount of smuggling in salt, would you believe? Bulk salt because of the fisheries, that paid duty. Some tobacco, of course, snuff. This sort of anything that had duty on it that the government wanted to raise some money, the smugglers would smuggle.
To literally get the flavour of the smuggling days of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, go to a pub and order a rum and shrub. The herbal liquor was added to hide the taste of seawater, which occasionally contaminated the contraband as it was spirited ashore. And to get another feel of the great days of sail, visit Charlestown Historic Harbour, especially when the impressive square riggers lie at their moorings. Anne Roberts.
They're all replicas of 18th and 19th century tall ships, used mainly for film and TV work.
They are appeared in quite a few films and TV, haven't they?
Yeah, yes, many films. Too many to list, really. And also recently in the last Hornblower series.
You can actually go on them and see them in action, so to speak.
Yes, indeed you can. Anything from a day sail, 3 hours, 6 hours, to a Cornish coastal trip, a couple of days sort of round the coast, or maybe over to France or to Spain. And it's as hands-on as you want it to be. If you want to get involved with the sailing, you can do. Help to set the sails, etc., climb the rigging. Or if you want to just sort of relax, that's fine too.
Really? So you can really feel the sailing, the traditional Cornish sailing life here?
That's right, absolutely, yeah.
Line scurvy, ambergris and marmalade, hoist up the tar devil all the way the bully boys. Line scurvy, ambergris and blubber, and we're
Bound for Cincinnati.
Perhaps fairly or unfairly, Cornwall's been renowned for its wrecking.
Yeah, this is something of a sort of mixed reputation. Because where Cornwall is geographically, the ships coming in from far deep water, not quite sure of where they are, and you've got this lump of land sticking out which is very rocky. There's a high proportion of risk of being shipwrecked. Now, when a ship was wrecked, then the Cornish wreckers, inverted commas, were quite happy to go down and exploit this because they knew very well that within a few hours or days everything would be lost and abandoned. So they didn't live very well, or very high, if you like, on the hog, and so wrecking was a means of subsistence. But the myths of actually luring ships ashore deliberately for the purpose of wrecking are totally unfounded. I mean, there's really no evidence that this ever happened.
Largely a Victorian myth, perhaps?
I think so. It seems to me it was probably designed, intended by legislators to emphasise the need for certain legislation. I mean, there definitely was a problem with wrecking. There was a big problem of people taking, if you like, somebody else's property to pieces and disposing of it. The insurers, people like Lloyd's, were very upset about this. The owners of cargo and ships were very upset. The problem was that people in the locality knew very well if you didn't move quickly, these would be totally destroyed by nature anyway. Had the owners paid a decent salvage to these people who'd risked their lives in the first place and said, well, you save the goods, we'll pay you an award for saving it, you wouldn't have had the problem.
Vessels caught on the rocks have left the seabed littered with wrecks, now visited by divers. I spoke to Ross Twelvetree of Dive St.Ives. Incredible wrecks can be found around the coast.
Yeah, there's several wrecks which come around here. The most popular one is the St. Chamond, which is, we call it the train wreck, which was a barge sank in the First World War on the 30th of April 1918, and it's about 2 miles off the headland. It was going from Glasgow to St.Ives, and it was hit by a German U-boat, U-boat 60. It tried to steam into St.Ives and it broke up about 2 miles off and sank. The boat's quite broken up, but it was carrying 6 steam engines, which are still intact on the bottom.
So you can dive underwater and find steam engines on the bottom of the seabed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing the first time you go down and see a steam engine just sort of materialise under the water, come up at you. It's a fantastic wreck to dive on.
And of course, dive around the area. It's a great thing to do for all ages.
Absolutely, yeah. We have people from sort of like the age of 12 who've just qualified. They're sort of the youngsters, and some people up at around 65 still dive. It's not a sort of sport which is reserved for the younger people.
How long would it take an absolute beginner who's never dived before to actually sort of get underwater with all the tanks and what have you?
To learn to dive, you could come and do like a taster session with us, which is 2.5 hours all in total, but you'll be in the water about 35-40 minutes.
But you actually do get to go underwater with the equipment on?
Absolutely, yeah.
Trade has always been Cornwall's lifeblood, but its greatest export has been its people. The song Cousin Jack, performed by the band Show of Hands, tells of miners forced to leave their home.
Will there be work in New Brunswick? Or will I find gold in the cave? If I tunnel way down to Australia, or will I ever escape? Where there's a mine or a hole in the
To find out more about the Great Cornish migrations, I spent some time in the convivial company of the Cornwall Family History Society, Secretary Pat Fawcett and librarian Trudy Martin.
We have people phoning up and they're very excited. They've discovered they've got Cornish ancestry. So we encourage them and say, oh yes, that's wonderful. We can possibly help you, and you can contact other members researching the same name. And what name is it you're researching? And they say Williams. Williams is the most common name in Cornwall. Roberts, again, is very difficult to identify their individuals.
You think of Williams as being a Welsh name and Roberts being a Scottish name?
That's right. But, and I don't know why we've got Williams, but Trudy might.
I'm not really sure. I mean, yes, Williams is just a name that comes from the forename of William. So I suppose it's all over the country, but somehow, and I don't know why, it does seem to be Celtic. So yes, Welsh, possibly even Irish, but certainly Cornwall, yes. But of course we do have very unusual surnames as well. I'm thinking of names like Penaluna, Penhaligon. There's a lovely one down in the Lizard area called Scaborio, and this actually comes from, I think, a place name called Skyborough. Now, I don't know whether there's any still left in the telephone book for Cornwall, but I'm sure there's probably some overseas.
So you get Penhaligons in Australia, the depths of Australia?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, I think they say now that probably there are more of the really lovely, odd-sounding Cornish names overseas than what there are left in Cornwall, which is sad, but as long as there's a Penhaligon somewhere in the world, that's all that matters.
There's huge emigration from Cornwall. When was that and why was it?
Well, I suppose it was mainly the 19th century. A lot of mines during that period in Cornwall, they closed and people had to go elsewhere to work.
What sort of places did they go to?
They went to Australia, New Zealand, North America, Canada, more obscure places like Cuba, north of Spain apparently, Cork, Limerick, even a Cornish community in Norway, so we understand. So in those areas you do find now Cornish associations, and they still have meetings and they get together and have their pasty lunches and celebrate being Cornish.
While in Truro, I met Anna Sage.
I'm from Wellington, New Zealand, and I'm in Cornwall researching my some missing slices of my family ancestry, going back from Charles Jack of Tregeartha.
They came from Cornwall?
Yes, round Penzance, mostly St. Berrien and St. Leven.
What have you found out about them? Why did they leave the country?
Not sure. The four brothers went to New Zealand and all became lighthouse keepers. So what I'm trying to do is find out what they were doing in Cornwall before they emigrated. This
is a Bible that you've got that was given to your ancestor Charles Tregeartha.
Yes, yeah. This was given to Charles Jack of Tregeartha by his Bible classmates on leaving for New Zealand, and it talks about how, whether they meet again in this world or the next, and wishing him well. And it's dated Bottoms, November the 19th, 1871, and they sailed on November the 21st.
It's a very touching document to have.
It is, yeah. It's a bit water-stained, and it's a treasure.
I'll leave the county behind, I'm not coming back. Oh, follow me down, cousin Jack.
There are a lot of grand houses in Cornwall. Their many rooms have provided homes for their owners, social venues for their guests, and fascinating places for visitors to explore.
What shall I do, right?
Aim at the
How about
front
this?
one. Front pin.
Yes, how about that?
Very neatly taken
One.
out.
That's your first rush.
Is it?
Yeah, you've
Do
got
I have
three.
to now go and get my ball?
Yeah, well, I do it myself.
I'll be
but-
a gentleman. Right,
Here we go. Oh no! Failure.
yeah, a bit wide.
There's a tad wild. So we've got. I joined a group from the North Cornwall National Trust Association at TheEar for a round of traditional Cornish outdoor skittles, or kales. Jeff Burrows is association chairman. It's a beautiful place.
Oh, indeed, yes, a lovely house. I think it could be most people's dream house, really, to live in something like this, I would think, yes.
It's now owned by the National Trust, as indeed are many houses throughout the county.
Yes, because particularly after the Second World War, landowners could no longer afford to keep the properties, so they either had the option to try and struggle on or to give it to someone like the National Trust where they thought it would be cared for. And, so in a sense, what the family's loss was the nation's gain.
And of course, we've got TheEar here, but there's also several other really beautiful houses.
Well, yes, and I suppose the crown is Lanhydrock on the sheer grounds of the size and the gardens and the parkland. I mean, that was given to the Trust 50 years ago. But there are other smaller houses. I mean, there's Anthony, which is just on this side of the border, near Plymouth, and Buckland Abbey, which is just over, which was at one time the home of Sir Francis Drake.
Can I just go back to Lanhydrock? I mean, what age is that? What sort of building is that?
It was originally built, the main house was built in the 1620s, 1630s. Really, its heyday was sort of the late Victorian, early Edwardian period.
Highlights of Lanhydrock for a visitor?
Well, I suppose the real gem of Lanhydrock is what is always referred to as the gallery ceiling, which dates back to 1650, is extremely rare these days. That really, I suppose, is a pièce de résistance. But there's lots of lovely rooms. I suppose to most people, the beauty of Lanhydrock is really that it's not grand in the sense of being a really large house. Most of the rooms are fairly small. They still appear as though they could be lived in, so you might see the family walking around at any time. I think that's to what most people, the appeal is, that it still appears to be like a family home.
A domestic home. What about Anthony? Is that the same?
Anthony, I think, is a little bit more grand. Anthony's made a Georgian house, so the rooms there are a little larger and perhaps a little more grand. That's the downstairs room. Of course, the upstairs is so much because the Cour Pole family still live in it, so it's very much a lived-in house, yes.
Family home.
It's a family home, yes. I mean, the same thing is at St. Michael's Mount, where the St. Leven family still own the house, but live in the house, but it's owned by the Trust, so everyone can go and see it.
And St. Michael's Mount, well worth visiting.
Oh, very much so, yes. I mean, the thrill of getting there. Yeah, you can walk across by the causeway if it's dry, but of course, after a little while, the causeway covers over the sea and you have to get a boat back.
To see a Cornish home built in strong vernacular style, you can't do much better than Godolphin House. Current resident, John Schofield.
It goes back to 1475. That was the date when the castle that preceded the house was pulled down and the present house was first built.
Very sturdy thing made out of granite with these massive Tuscan columns.
Yes, well, all of that is a bit later. I mean, the house, the basis of the house goes back to 1475, but of course there have been many changes to it from a design point of view as time has gone on. The ideas behind it, the architectural concept and the planning of it clearly come from Inigo Jones and the metropolitan ideas, which derived initially from northern Italy, and it's been carried out by a local surveyor whose work you can see in other Cornish houses, Penheal perhaps, and Lanhydrock, and it's now a marvellous and very successful fusion of these sophisticated ideas with the local granite idiom. And I think it's a mark of the strength of the local granite idiom that it's not been completely swamped.
But of course, the Godolphin family were a strong family in Cornish history.
The Godolphins were important from quite early on, from maybe 1300, but they rose to their greatest state really at the time of the 16th and 17th centuries at Godolphin, and then from there on they became absentee landlords and eventually wound up as being, in effect, Prime Minister to Queen Anne. They derived their wealth from the tin that was under their land, and they had a huge family industry in tin, and copper too for that matter. But in the 1530s, Sir William Godolphin had the biggest tin works in the county. So from starting out as tenant farmers in the 12th and 13th centuries, they rose to that position of heading the government by 1707-08.
The grand houses of Cornwall and the families that live in them are an integral part of Cornish history.
I'm Peter Prideaux-Brune, and we're at Prideaux Place in Padstow.
You can trace your ancestry back in this area for many centuries.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we were at Prideaux Castle, further down south in Cornwall, when William the Conqueror arrived. We were an old Celtic family called Prideaux, and we changed the name to Prideaux within one generation after William the Conqueror came to fit in with the new French administration.
You're very much allied to yourself with the new power then?
Oh, certainly, yes. I mean, we knew which side our bread was buttered on. Maybe we were better Europeans than people are now. I don't know.
And Prideaux Place, could you describe what this place is?
Well, it's an Elizabethan house, basically, built by my 14 times great-grandfather in 1488. And but it's been added on to over the years, so much so I wish they hadn't added on so much. We've got no less than 81 rooms here. 46 of them are bedrooms. We don't use all of those. In fact, most of them are as the American Army left them for D-Day, complete with signs on the door saying Sergeant's Mess, and the graffiti inside saying rather ruder things about the sergeants.
It's also been the location of many films.
Yes, we love having films here. We've had sort of silly little films, big blockbuster films, a lot of German films here, funnily enough, in doing television series of the Rosamund Pilcher stories.
Rosamund Pilcher is much more popular in Germany.
She's huge in Germany, much bigger than in England. And they make this series for German television, which is, I mean, it's like sort of Dad's Army, Blackadder, everything rolled into one. It's so popular, repeated and repeated and repeated. And we've had 6 here. With the result that 70% of our coach business in the summer is German tourists coming to see where these films have been made. I always insist, rather like Hitchcock, on having a small part in all the films. I mean, I'm not proud. I mean, the last one I was dressed as a chauffeur cleaning the windscreen of my own Bentley, but as long as I appear.
Prideaux Place is important for the Obios celebrations. When does that take place? What's that about?
That's on May the 1st every year. No one really knows what it's about. The general consensus is that it's actually an ancient fertility rite. But it's something that they dance around Padstow once a year on May Day. And it has become a tourist attraction, obviously, but the one really private thing is when in the afternoon they come and dance in the house, and that is Padstow's purely private celebration. It's not up to me who comes into the house for that. They have people on the door who decide, well, if you're 5th generation Padstow, then you can come in. And that is a wonderful scene.
Just down the road from Prideaux Place, and also well worth a visit, is Pencarrow House, the home of Lady Iona Molesworth St Aubyn. When did you first see or come to Pencarrow?
it was such a long time ago, it's very difficult to remember. Must have been when I was 18, and I'm now 70, so whatever time that was, in the 50s. Mm-hmm. Yes, mid-50s.
Under what circumstances? Why did you first come here?
I came because my husband had asked me to come to a dance. There were a couple of dances, one on Friday night, one on Saturday night, and then go beating on the Saturday, go shooting. They shot and we went beating.
So it was a weekend and...
Yes, it was a weekend with a lot of people, and then in the evening we would play Black Dog, which meant closing all the lights off in the house and running around. And one person was it was the same as tag. Usually ended up by somebody being carted off with a broken leg or arm, but it was great fun.
So it was quite a social place then, this house?
Yes, there were a lot of very famous people came here, and we got an autograph book, which is wonderful, of all the sort of thank you letters, pictures that they had time to paint, and writings and stories.
So as well as being a traditional Cornish manor house, it's also a social hub.
Well, most definitely it was.
And of course, they had Arthur Sullivan stayed here.
Arthur Sullivan stayed here for 3 weeks with Andalusia, William's wife. He was recovering from the death of his mother, and she was very good. She was a tremendous society hostess, but on this occasion, she only had one other person staying, and Arthur Sullivan had been bullied by Gilbert to finish the music for Iolanthe because he was well behind. He wasn't very well. And he did a lot of the music for Iolanthe while he stayed here.
Tripping hither, tripping thither, no watching, no swine, no wither.
And of course, the house is surrounded by a beautiful garden.
The gardens are very good. They're mainly 19th century, because the man living here, William Molesworth, was a tremendous gardener. One of the first monkey puzzle trees came here, and the name monkey puzzle was actually named here. And in 1834, he was planting the tree with some friends, and it was written up in a horticultural journal that this man, Charles Alston, said, Aurea caria imbricata, what a puzzle for a monkey. And the name stuck. Amongst other things, when he was making the garden, this is the first big rock garden in England, even before Chatsworth. And he made the lake and planted the drive, which goes through the Iron Age fort. Imagine doing that nowadays. You couldn't do that, could you?
Back at the Cales match at Trerice, I asked Jeff about the National Trust Associations.
Right. Stand by. Here we go. Oh, yes!
They are.
Just a brief word about the National Trust Association. Obviously, they must be a group of people who very much enjoy these sort of places.
It is a group of people who are members of the National Trust, but who are on the social side. So in fact, they're like-minded people who can enjoy sort of talks and things and visits, sometimes to other National Trust homes, but other properties as well. So it is a social group. The main purpose of it is that all the money that we raise goes back to the trust. So what we do is fundraising for the trust and having, good times at the same time.
So it's social, it's shared interest, and also doing good.
Well, we hope that I think so. I mean, we get rent to give about £3,000 to £3,500 a year to the trust, often for things that they cannot afford to do. And
can you give an example?
Well, I think one of the nicest recent examples is a very small property that we didn't mention was the old post office at St.Ives, which is very small. That was given to the Trust 100 years ago, in fact one of the earliest properties the Trust owned. But if you've ever been there, you'll find that trying to get upstairs is a somewhat hazardous exercise because the stairs are very narrow, they are steep, and you've got some difficult turns. So a lot of people cannot get to see the upside. So they decided a little while ago, they asked if they could have a small laptop computer so that they can have a virtual tour on that. So people who cannot get up the stairs can see the upstairs just by watching the programme on the computer.
Oh, look at that.
I think that makes you, Jeff, the outright champion. The grand houses of Cornwall, with their elegant gardens and rich architecture, are an essential part of the county's heritage. They are also homes for their owners, social beacons for their guests, and great places to go for the many who visit year after year.
With £55 million of lottery money and nationwide publicity, the Eden project has captured the public's imagination. Eden shows a modern appreciation of the environment, yet horticultural innovation has been going on in Cornwall for centuries.
I wanted to ask you what you thought of Eden project.
Liked it? Yes, liked it. Very impressive. It opens your eyes to a lot of things that are going on and ways to improve things.
The boys loved it.
What do you think of it?
It's nice.
Well, yeah, we liked it very much.
Yeah.
Yes, very inspiring.
Very inspiring.
We've been here for the second time, so I think everybody should come here. So every second year to see the new development.
It was really lovely. I really enjoyed myself, and I reckon the plants were absolutely beautiful.
How about yourself?
Tremendous. This is the 8th time I've been here. Come every year, bring a group of students. They're all tourism students, and it's most important visitor attraction here in the southwest.
I'll be back in the future.
Meanwhile, at the bottom of the garden, something was stirring. I joined Scylla George at Trevano, near Helston.
Yes, they're little baby peacocks. We've got several out here at the moment.
They're white peacocks?
Yes, most of them are white, but we have got one or two brown ones. Some of them are obviously bigger than others. And there's one mother that's got a little one. And it's amazing how they still have their little tufts, their little crowns.
Yeah, I was going to say the babies themselves got crests.
Well, that's right. But they're pecking along with mum, quite happily.
It's quite an informal garden, really.
Oh yes, the garden at Trevano is very informal. It's more of a relaxed garden. We have gardeners that actually speak to you. So, no one's actually frightened to go up and ask questions about the plants. Obviously, the gardeners know more about the plants than I do. It's not my forte, unfortunately.
You'll get people coming up perhaps with problems they have in their own gardens, asking for solutions.
Well, yes, to a certain point, but obviously the gardens here are quite old gardens. A lot of them are Victorian, so a lot of the plants are no longer seen. They were brought over by the plant hunters, in the early stages, when this was a lovely big estate garden and belonged to one particular family, the Bickford Smiths.
It was the result of competitive Victorian plant collectors.
Well, like many of the gardens were in Victorian times, I think a lot of the sort of like landed gentry would pay for plant hunters to go out, and provided they brought back some plants for them. And I think it was very competitive at the time. From what I can gather, they used to have grand parties when they came back with the plants and sort of like showed them off to their friends, and it was sort of like one-upmanship with plants.
Where are we going now?
Well, I was going to show you towards the Italian garden and then take you down towards the new play area, because obviously we have to cover every age group these days, and then perhaps we'll wander back towards the organic section.
Excellent.
But we'll see.
We'll see. I like the secret room.
Well, this is from the viewpoint, which we opened up last year. We're looking down towards the lake, the Gothic potting shed, or as we're now calling it, the bothy. And down below us, to the right-hand side, is the Victorian boathouse, which we did up last year, repainted and refurbished some of the glass there, the old stained glass. But it's the focal point of the garden, the lovely Victorian boathouse at the end of the lake. And we've now got ducks, and we've even got black-necked swans on the lake now. They've come to stay, and that would lead you down through into the bog garden. We have a pet cemetery, one for cats and one for dogs. And because Trevano is at the base of a valley, it's actually one of the best places to be. There's hardly any breeze down there, even if it's, blowing a gale on top.
Come into the garden, Lord, for the blackbird night has flown. Come into the garden, Lord, I am here at the gate alone. I am here at the gate.
Now, this must be one of the quintessential, most English places you could be. Where are we?
Well, we're in the National Museum of Gardening, which opened in 2000 or 2001. This area is actually divided into 10 themed areas, and we're actually standing in the one that has all the watering cans and watering pots.
Now, it does sound bizarre to be standing in front of a display of watering cans, which must be one of the most everyday items, but they actually are. It's brilliant, isn't it? It's fantastic. You've got some ones you could imagine Mary, Mary, quite contrary holding.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of copper ones here. I mean, for instance, the one in front of us there has been welded several times. It was obviously a very well-loved watering can, obviously very well balanced for the lady of the house or the head gardener to use. And, you know, they've just taken a character of their own.
Oh, we've got a particularly old one here.
Yes, this one actually dates back to 1590. It's terracotta.
So English gardens, it's a tradition that goes back centuries.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, Romans would recognise half the tools that we've got on display here.
England is known for its gardening. Why? Why this nation and gardens?
I don't know. I suppose it's because, generally speaking, the weather is very good over here. We have fertile land.
I think many foreigners would agree with that.
Well, probably not, but it's... I hesitate to say it's something slightly eccentric about particularly the Victorian gardeners, and it was a little bit of one-upmanship as well. And because of the industrial age coming in at that point, they experimented with things like watering cans, and then the lawnmowers came along, and it's actually quite fascinating.
So I suppose it started in the Victorian as both a nostalgia for things past and also one-upmanship.
I would have thought so. I mean, you know, in the earlier years, a lot of the gentry would go around on these grand tours, so they came back with ideas for the gardens and that sort of thing. And the tools that we've got on display are ordinary people's tools. They would have been affordable to most of the gardeners in Victorian Britain.
Let's have a look at another bit.
In the 60s, you had plastic brought in. It was the death knell of the old-fashioned terracotta pot.
And here, you know, we're getting into deep English eccentricity here. We've got a display of lawnmowers.
Oh yes, great display on lawnmowers here, including one of a horse-drawn grass cutter that was first painted by Alexander Shanks, and it probably led to the term Shanks's pony because the gentleman used to have to walk along behind it to guide it along.
It manures as it cuts as it grows.
Well, virtually, and probably the pony or the horse would have worn shoes, and you've got a display of little horse boots there on the left-hand side as well. It was to save the lawn being cut up by the hooves.
Horse slippers, I would say.
Oh yes, they look more like children's booties. Leather ones, obviously made by the local blacksmith and the leather worker.
And we're seeing here a lady from the 1950s. No home was without a ransom 14-inch ball-bearing ripper.
That's right. I mean, they have some funny names. I mean, one of their more famous names is Atco, and you've got Green's Lawns Mowers and things like that. But, you know, there's something about these old-fashioned lawnmowers as well.
I'll stick with a 14-inch ball-bearing ripper. For 70 years, the gardens of Heligan were lost to nature. But, as Peter Stafford explains, once the weeds were cut back, an enchanting Victorian world was revealed.
Yes, magical particularly because it had been untouched. So we ended up with a derelict but original Paxton greenhouse, and we ended up with the pineapple pits that would otherwise have been taken away to make way for somewhere else, because by then you could buy pineapples in Safeways for 95 pence a tin.
Pineapple pit, what's that about?
The pineapple pit we thought was simply a large coal frame. It's in the middle of the melon yard. But luckily Peter Thoday, the Victorian kitchen garden guru, came and told us that it was almost certainly one of the last surviving examples of a pineapple pit, not a traditional coal frame, when the Victorians learned how to grow pineapples from South Africa, because they, like us, their social hierarchy is very much based on the food they could put on the table. So if they could put pineapples on the table where nobody else in England could, except a few royalty around London would get pineapples coming in from the docks, but otherwise they didn't travel, and they weren't known. Nobody knew how to grow them. But they learned how to grow them down here in Heligan using basically compost and manure heat technology and cavity walls It's difficult to describe simply in words, but it's a very, very clever system of heating a cold frame based on the fact that compost, as it goes into manure, gives off heat. And they had cavity walls on the side of the pit, just as they had cavity walls at the back of the Paxton greenhouse. So they knew about heating things with cavity walls, and they just put compost and cavity walls together and have 13 degrees centigrade when it's 0 degrees centigrade outside without any fuel other than that.
And of course there was a race to get the pineapple for the Christmas dinner.
There's always a race. I think there was probably more of a race to get grapes for the Christmas dinner. They were particularly clever in learning how to keep. Once they learned how to grow grapes, they learned how to keep grapes ripe in dark houses in little specially made glass bottles, so that they could have ripe grapes at Christmas, which of course was an unheard of delicacy. Pineapples were probably a little bit easier than grapes for Christmas.
And of course, now the modern gardens, the modern refound gardens, is quite innovative in itself.
Yes, I think so. We have sort of two phrases, if you like. One is looking backwards and forwards at the same time, and the second is using the best of the old and the new, which is really very much a Victorian philosophy. If they'd had tractors and barbed wire and nitrogen, they'd have used them. So although we've got the facility to use those now, we tend not to because we're aware of the consequences of doing it. So we try to be innovative in the way that the Victorians were without automatically using all the latest technology. So we do everything in the vegetable garden by hand. We use no machinery. We double dig. We add the same sort of inputs that they would have had, including seaweed from the local beaches.
You also have revived or continue the tradition of charcoal burning.
Yes, we have. Of course, charcoal is considered now to be something that just does barbecues on patios. Actually, it fueled the Industrial Revolution. It was the thing that fueled the big furnaces that produced all the wrought iron.
So we're going back to our industrial roots in the lost gardens of Helican.
I think we're going back to a bit of common sense and practicality and trying to throw away less. We've become a disposable society, and we're trying to dispose of much less than would be the easy way out.
My heart would hear and beat were it earth in an earthly bed. Come, my own, my sweet. Come, my own, my sweet. Lord, Lord, come, find me here at a gate I
Cornwall has many beautiful gardens for the green-fingered to visit. Ray and Shirley Clemo own the Pine Lodge Gardens and Nursery.
My wife and I started this garden at Pine Lodge some 30 years ago, and here we are 30 years later at 74 and 73, still here busy 7 days a week and enjoying what we've been doing. We wanted a garden that had colour in all year round.
Well, because December and January, we at one year I actually listed 135 plants that were out in bloom in the garden. The ones that really are so beautiful here are the correas. We have reds and pinks and greens, white, lime green, and right across the spectrum, all the colours except blues, of course. No blues in it. And another thing is, of course, our lovely daphnes, which the scent is overwhelming in the garden.
We usually have daphnes on the table on the Christmas Day on the table. Usually cut a piece, yes.
Yes, we always do.
Yeah.
Every Christmas.
How about the summer?
Oh, well, I mean, it's overwhelming, the colour. Right the way through the year, we've always got colour and scent, which is so important in a garden. It doesn't stop at the end of spring, like so many gardens say, well, it's only a spring garden, but ours is a whole year of flowers.
Have you found that it's easier to grow more warm-loving plants? I mean, I'm thinking about global warming and such.
Yeah, if you're talking about global warming, it is, of course, 30 years ago when we started here, There are many new plants that we can grow here that we couldn't grow then. There's a distinct change in our climate here and what we can grow.
Over the years we try all these different plants, and now we're finding that because I hold a national collection of grevilleas here, more and more tender ones of those we're able to try out. And in the old days, perhaps 3 or 4, and now we're up to 20. So that in itself tells us something. That's another sign of how much warmer it's getting.
Horticultural innovation has been a hallmark of Cornwall's gardeners for generations. They may now need to be some of the first to adapt to gardening in a warmer world.
Cornwall has not always been as safe or as peaceful as it is today. Fears of invasion and of civil unrest have led to the construction of some of the county's most dramatic buildings.
Well, I thought I'd start tonight with a smuggling tale, but a cautionary one, you might say, and this is a very, very appropriate place to tell it. For in days gone by, before the Lambeth Walk was built, that was built in the late 20s, this stretch along here from where we started the walk up to the Lifeboat House was the most popular place for smugglers to land their contraband. And well, smuggling, it sort of has a very romantic, even boy's own sort of adventure image, but it too had its darker side. And well, smuggling, it was carried out in St.Ives.
I joined one of Shanty Barber's ghost walks in St.Ives with a group of apparently sane people paying good money in the hope of being scared witless. Why do people want to be frightened?
Well, I think the oldest and strongest human emotion is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is fear of the unknown.
So fears make good stories?
They do, they make the best.
Big crowd today. I mean, people have a fascination for the supernatural as well. We heard, do people often come up and tell their own tales of the supernatural?
They do. I have my own little black book of different properties in St. Ives, so people have stayed, especially holiday homes where they've stayed once and won't be staying again.
Does that mean that you believe in ghosts after that?
I definitely do. I spent a year living in India with a yogi up in the Himalayas, and he was a tantric yogi, but his particular sect was Agora, and they are specialists in the occult. And I learned some things there which leaves me with no doubt at all.
And is the occult a frightening thing then?
It is. Well, my experience is it's big boy stuff, and I'm just a little boy.
One of Cornwall's most impressive sights is the brooding presence of Bodmin's Georgian Jail, towering over modern suburban houses. Incongruously the home of a cosy pub and restaurant, threats and fears still cling to its granite walls. Landlord Simon Wheaton.
It was a county prison, which meant it was a short-term prison. Basically, nobody stayed here for more than 2 years. But, of course, we had 53 people hung. So, logically, they wouldn't have been here for a long period of time.
They wouldn't have been here that long. Yeah. What would they have been hung for?
The offences are varied, simple things like sheep stealing, burning of corn, numerous simple offences. Things that today you'd be hardly likely to get 6 weeks for.
But perhaps the imposing building was giving a warning to people.
I think the buildings themselves are definitely imposing. You look at them from the outside and it has that look. You know exactly where you're coming.
It has a certain number of spooky stories associated with it.
Yeah, we have an awful lot of people who claim to be mediums or psychics who come here and encounter everything from, the usual grey woman walking across a landing, children crying, and a lot of the ladies and men visibly upset in tears when they leave by what they've seen. So if I'm personally not a psychic myself, but whatever it is they see reduces them to tears.
If not yourself.
If not me, yes.
So you leave this, you're neutral about it. What are your opinions about it?
Well, if you'd have asked me the question 14 months ago, I would have said that it doesn't exist. After living here for 14 months and experiencing various things, you tend to be more sceptical and more... There's something going on at Bodmin Jail. There's no doubt about that. there is a sort of a presence of some sort going on. I can't work out exactly what it is, but it's fairly obvious when you see, I've seen candles exploding off tables with no one within 15 feet of them, not even lit. I've seen sort of people walk through a bar when there's no one there.
And this is from a confirmed cynic beforehand.
This is still a cynic, I still maintain that you have to keep an open mind to all these things. But stones thrown at you in empty buildings, it's quite amazing, really.
Sounds absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah.
You are charged that you gave a certain night the pair of sixpence, willfully murder Charlotte Diamond. How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Mr. Cour, the case for the prosecution. Yes.
If you're in Bodmin, go along to the town's courtroom experience and, as manager Stephanie Meads explains, follow the saga of a notorious criminal case.
The story is about the trial of Matthew Weeks for the murder of Charlotte Diamond in 1844 on Bodmin Moor.
It causes quite a debate afterwards.
Yes, it does, simply because it was very much circumstantial evidence, and therefore there has always been a question mark over the fact if Matthew did it or not.
And visitors can make their own mind up?
Yes, they can. The visitors who come to watch the trial can actually act as the jury and vote if Matthew is guilty or not of the crime.
And once they've heard the evidence, they've made their decision, they can go and see the cells?
Yes, we have the holding cells below the courtroom, and they can visit the holding cells, which haven't changed much since the days Matthew was held there on the day of his trial.
Quite a sinister place then.
It's a bit dark and spooky, yes. It's got quite a feel to it.
And just to explain, the actual courtroom experience is in quite a lovely building, really.
Yes, it is. This was the county courts. Was built in 1837 and was the county courts right up to the 1980s when the courts moved down to Truro.
Sovereignty and rule have found their expression in bricks and mortar in many places in Cornwall. I spoke to Professor Philip Payton, Director of the Institute of Cornish Studies. Launceston or Lanson used to be the capital of Cornwall. It's got a very impressive castle. Why was that built?
Yes, Lanson Castle is impressive. It dominates the River Tamar, and as you approach River Tamar from the English side, as it were, you can see the castle up there on the hill, looking down, and that really gives us a clue to why the castle was built. It was built after the Norman conquest, and it was part of the securing of the new Anglo-Norman kingdom, but specifically, it secured Cornwall. It was a fortress on the border, if you like. Rather like the great castles in Wales that were built rather later, it was a physical and very visible means of asserting who is the boss here.
It was the home of quite a sinister jail as well.
Yes, the idea of Lanson Jail has come down through history as being a place of incarceration. And of course, it was the jail for Cornwall for a great many years, reflecting not only the importance of the castle itself, but the status of Lanson as Cornish capital in the medieval times.
Cornwall, for the English authorities, was seen as, for a large part, as a place beyond the pale.
In many respects, yes. Cornwall was at the edge of the realm. It was culturally different. It was Cornish speaking. There was always a sense that Cornwall was potentially rebellious, like Wales and indeed like Ireland later on.
But in fact, it did become rebellious during some times of its time in its history.
It did, yes. I mean, I think that in the Tudor period, particularly when the English state was consolidating itself, was becoming more centralised, was flexing its muscles in relation to Wales and Scotland and Ireland, but also Cornwall. And the Cornish rose in two memorable rebellions, one in 1497, when the Cornish were objecting to, well, they're objecting to a number of things. They were objecting to taxes to wage a war against the Scots on the grounds that it's nothing to do with the Cornish, but also a variety of ancient usages in the stannery system, which regulated Cornish tin tin mining, had been intruded upon and suspended by the central government, and that outraged the Cornish as well. In 1549 there was a second rebellion, this time against the Reformation, the introduction of the English Book of Common Prayer, which in its way, of course, was also a feature of central government interference, and the Cornish rebelled against the new prayer book and the Protestant religion, and also in defence of the Cornish language. The Cornish said, "We, the Cornishmen, utterly refuse this new English." So it's about preservation of identity as well.
Times of war and threats of war were witnessed by other Cornish buildings. We've got many other castles and fortifications in Cornwall, most famous being Pendennis. Why was that built then? That was a Tudor castle.
Pendennis is a Tudor castle. In fact, you might argue that castle is the wrong name. It's perhaps a fort, a fortification. It dominates the high ground at Pendennis above Falmouth, protecting Falmouth Haven, which even today is quite an important harbour, but which in those days was of even greater strategic importance. Henry VIII, of course, who built the castle, was aggressively English in his foreign policy, and that meant that there was always fears of invasion from, well, initially from the French, later from the Spanish. And although they didn't materialise in Henry's days, of course, the Spanish Armada sailed right past Pendennis on its way up the English Channel during Elizabeth's reign. Although they didn't attempt to take Falmouth Haven itself. You might say that was perhaps partly because the Pendennis, the deterrent value, had worked.
And of course, Pendennis has become was a fortification throughout history, even into the Second World War.
Absolutely. I mean, it saw action in the Civil War. It was it and Raglan Castle in Wales were the last of the royalist strongholds to surrender. It was then really that Pendennis earned its big place in British history. But yes, and even in the Second World War, there was a garrison there. And if you visit Pendennis today, you will see some of the emplacements and bunkers and so on that were installed around the edge of the fort during the Second World War. Because again, a very strategic place. And if the Germans had decided to attack southwest Britain, Falmouth Haven inevitably would be one of the places that they would have headed for. Pendennis would have been one of the places where a spirited defence would have been mounted.
Another spectacular no-show from Johnny Foreigner resulted in the building of Bodmin Barracks, now home to the Museum of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. Major Hugo Wight.
The threat was from Napoleon III, who had aspirations across the whole of Europe to enlarge the French Empire. It was considered in England that there was a threat of invasion. Whether that was so or not is rather dubious now. But along the south coast, particularly around the naval bases, enormous fortresses like Tregantle Fort were put up at immense cost. Similarly, the militia of England, which was a conscripted force, had bases built like this one, where if there was an invasion, they could muster and draw their weapons and be ready to fight the French.
So they felt that Bodmin was at risk even in the 1850s from France?
It wasn't Bodmin as such, but the Cornwall militia were recruited from Cornwall as a whole. And if the balloon had gone up, everybody in the militia would have made their way to Bodmin so that the militia battalion could take the field.
And of course they were forced to join the army, they didn't volunteer.
They were. People think that there was no conscription in the British Army before 1916. This is not so. Going right back into the mists of time, into the Anglo-Saxon Fyrds, it was the duty of able-bodied men in times of danger to take up arms and fight for their king. The militia goes back a long, long way. It was a conscripted force, and all males between the age of 18 and 45 were eligible for militia service. The names were put in a hat and were picked out. It was a very unpopular service. The amount of training they had to do was quite considerable, and nobody liked it. If you could raise £10, you could pay what was known as a fine and get out of your militia service. providing you could find another man who'd step in your place. Again, if he could provide the £10, he would get out of it. The result was, in fact, in the militia, that it went right down to the lowest bit of society, the men who couldn't find any money to get out of militia service, and it was not a terribly efficient organisation at that time.
Surprising, it was a French threat, so they decided to build a French-looking chateau.
I don't know why, and nobody's been able to discover the reason. We think it's probably somebody with a sense of humour that with a French threat built a French building, or maybe they were just wondering which side would win and laying their bets either way.
Fears can be irrational, feeding suspicion and prejudice. Fears can be eminently sensible, the best way of saving your skin. Real or imaginary, fear is a strong emotion, and strong emotions spur people to action. The results are some of the most imposing, yet impressive, buildings in Cornwall.
When in the 16th century the Spanish Armada was spotted off the Cornish coast, fires were lit to tell of the nation's peril. To this day, Cornwall is a crucial part of Britain's eyes, ears and voice to the world.
A lighthouse's foghorn giving warning to ships at sea. Cornwall's treacherous coast is dotted with beacons.
My name is Eddie Matthews. I've worked for Trinity House for 48 years. I've worked on this Lizard Lighthouse for 17 years. First as a keeper, then as a attendant to the place, just looking after the place. Lizard Lighthouse is exactly 251 years old.
It must be one of the oldest in the country then.
It is one of the oldest in the country. It is also one of the biggest in the country.
Oh really? So it's not your actual 60-watt bulb up there?
No. It's not the bulbs that do the trick, it's the glasswork around the lens, the Fresnel lenses that magnify the bulb. The actual bulb is only 400 watts.
It's minuscule.
That's all it is. When you see it in a minute, you'll be very surprised. But it throws that light 26 miles. It's still a working lighthouse, controlled from Harwich and Essex. But there again, old computers are very good, but they can't clean the glass, and they can't change the bulb, and they can't cut the grass. So somebody's going to be looking after it, and that's my job at the moment.
So there still is a role for a lighthouse keeper?
Yes and no. Not on the operational side, but just looking after the place.
But there's still a very important part of navigation around the coast, then, presumably?
Oh, yes. I mean, you try to take one away of these lighthouses, which is just an example, they just had tried Condrevy Lighthouse. Such an uproar from the local fishermen that caused them to keep the Condrevy Lighthouse on.
Despite all this modern technology, is it psychological? They want to see the light over the water, or do they actually need it?
Oh no, in my opinion, I think they still need it, especially the local ones.
L'autoroute qui relie le Tyrol à la Bavière a été fermée
pour les volatiles français. The to require SUVs, minivans and pickup trucks.
Within shouting distance of the Lizard Lighthouse stands a hut which was crucial in the birth of modern radio and is now in the care of the National Trust. Here's volunteer steward Neville Green.
Well, the story is that Marconi came in this country in 1894, and he'd already invented the radio wave in his own town in Italy. More or less across the room by a wire attached to the door handle, and with the help of his mother, he got a signal across the room. He tried to get his own government interested, but had no luck. He then came to England and tried our government and got no luck. He then carried out experiments in London, more or less from street to street, corner to corner. His signal basically was line of sight in those days. However, he eventually got the GPO interested, and the Admiralty and the Army, and he carried out further experiments on Salisbury Plain. Again, it's by line of sight. The higher the aerial, the further signal will go. He then carried out transmissions across the Bristol Channel to prove that the signal would go across water. Having done all that then, he moved to the Isle of Wight. He set up the first radio station in Allen Bay. It opened in 1897, closed down again in 1900, the reason being because he had too much electrical interference. At that time, he had then achieved a distance from the Isle of Wight, from Allen Bay, to Bournemouth, some 18 miles distance. But he had the theory that the radio wave would go beyond the curvature of the Earth. The boffins of the day said, no, impossible. It's line of sight. However, he moved from Allen Bay when he closed that station down, and he moved to St. Catherine's Point on the south side of the Isle of Wight. He set up a radio station there. He then came to Cornwall, looked around Cornwall, and he found the most suitable place was here in the Lizard at Penolver Point. And he bought this shed from the Great Western Railway. It was a storage shed. It's still the original one today. He put his equipment down here, and he himself stood in this radio room here at the Lizard and received the first signal from St. Catherine's in the Isle of Wight. He then proved that the signal will go beyond the curvature of Earth, as the distance is roughly 196 miles.
What did he signal?
It was in Morse code. It was just a few dots, but he got a signal.
Okay.
And 2 years later then, he done the transatlantic call from Marconi to Newfoundland, and the first letter there was the letter S in Morse code.
And did he do that from here?
No, we done it at Poldhu, the other side of Mullion.
Keith Matthew helps look after this famous spot.
Well, we're standing on holy ground here, of course. Poldhu is the place that Marconi chose in 1901 to do his famous transatlantic experiment. The cliffs here then were the site of the large aerials that were erected and the first really high-powered radio station in the world. And on the 12th of December 1901, with Marconi in St. John's, Newfoundland, listening on an incredibly primitive receiver, he heard just the 3 clicks, the 3 dots, that meant that he had succeeded and that the £50,000 that he had spent on the experiment, which he'd got out of his company as a 26-year-old, with no evidence that anything would work at all, you can imagine how relieved he must have felt when he heard those 3 clicks. Some of the very early experiments on high-power shortwave transmission were carried out on this site. One rather interesting thing here was that the very first coaxial cable ever made in the world, or ever used in the world, was used here to link the transmitter to the experimental antennas.
Coaxial cable being the sort of undersea cables now?
Well, even more mundane than that. Your coax cable from your TV aerial down to your TV set. That the great granddaddy of that was actually pioneered on this site.
Amateur Radio Group. Roger, roger. Hello, Bill. This is Delta Lima 4, Yankee Amateur Radio. You are very strong this afternoon here, 5 and 9, 59. And then you see Tango, Inland, Ontario. And
for radio hams, the place is a mecca.
The Poldhu Amateur Radio Club have been extremely fortunate to celebrate the centenary in 2001 of the first transmission. The National Trust, together with the Marconi Company and the Objective One European money, altogether managed to produce a very, very modern and beautifully comfortable interpretation centre, which also provides a home for the Poldhu Amateur Radio Club.
Great fun, is it?
Yes, we're here every Tuesday and Friday, weather and wise permitting, and we have possibly 40 or 50 active local members, and then we have a large number of associate members, both in the rest of the UK and over the world. Our call sign, which is Golf Bravo 2 Golf Mike, or GB2 Giulielmo Marconi, if you prefer, is very well known, and The only thing that has to be said is that every time you use it, you're very lucky if one person replies. It's usually about 100.
What we have in this room is all the equipment that you would have at one end of a working submarine cable circuit. But we've got it duplicated to represent both the sending and the receiving end, because we can therefore demonstrate sending a message, relaying it through an intermediate station, and receiving it at the other end, all in the one room.
What sort of era would this thing be from?
Oh, we're now in the 1920s, 1930s. But this sort of equipment was still in use almost up to the closure of the last cable in 1970. Certainly by the 1960s, this equipment was still being used.
John Packer, Honorary Curator of the Porthcurno Telegraph Museum. Burrowed deep within granite cliffs to protect it from World War II bombs, it's a place that fascinates visitors.
Well, the story starts in 1870, when a cable from the beach here went all the way to India. And by 2 or 3 years later, it was extended via India to Australia, New Zealand and Hong Kong. In other words, everywhere in the Far East. And this was why the company that built the system was called the Eastern Telegraph Company. But as years went by, more and more cables were laid, some heading westwards, some across the North Atlantic, some to South America, some to South Africa. By the outbreak of World War II, there were 14 cable systems, starting from the beach here, and the cables radiated all around the world, really.
And it continued into quite recent times.
Yes, the last cable went out of service in 1970, which was exactly a century after the first cable opened here.
Replaced by what, modern satellite communication?
Partly by satellite, partly by more cables, but not the old-fashioned telegraph cables. There are cables landing on the beach here at the moment. The last cable to be laid, called Gemini, one of a pair of cables across the North Atlantic, landed on the beach here only 2 or 3 summers ago.
And that would be what, for private telephone calls? Or what will be going down those cables?
High-speed binary code, not dots and dashes, but noughts and ones, computer code, carrying people on the internet, or people talking on telephones, or video signals for the television companies. It doesn't matter what you start off with. In this digital age, it all ends up as a stream of bits.
Bringing telecommunications right up to date is British Telecom's strangely named site of Goonhilly. Here's Marketing Officer Denise Hill. What is Goonhilly?
Goonhilly is an Earth satellite station, which sounds a little bit wild, doesn't it? I often thought that people might think that I work on the Earth and I could be transferred to the Moon office. But in fact, what we're actually doing is receiving data and signals from all over the world, transmissions on telephone, fax, data, television programs, etc., and relaying them then all around the country and all around the world.
With these big dishes, it does look slightly extraterrestrial, though, doesn't it?
It's very exciting. You should see it on a misty morning with these huge dishes rising up through the mist. It reminds me a little bit about an episode of Doctor Who and the Daleks, something like that. But yes, they're magnificent. British engineering. I'm very proud of them.
And it was one of the first satellite tracking stations.
That's right. It was actually built to track a satellite called Telstar, which some people may have actually heard, which was the first ever satellite that was sent up into space. They didn't really know what they were doing. It was all very exciting. The unfortunate thing was that at the time, the technology meant that they couldn't send it far enough out into space so that it turned at the same rate as the Earth. So they built 3 of these satellite dishes, one in Goonhilly, one in France and one in America, and we from the Goonhilly one could track it for 20 minutes every 2 hours, and we got the first pictures of television coming in here from America. It was very exciting.
And of course it was so exciting we got a record called Telstar.
That's right, it was very big on the news. So obviously people not seeing pictures like this from the other side of the world. Up until then, things had to be sent by tape. Now we could have live broadcasts from the other side of the world. It was very exciting.
So we've got things here about electronic communications in the past, present and future. Shall we have a look?
Certainly.
Now this is a real blast from the past.
Yes, the 1960s. Who remembers the trim phone? And I bet you'll recognise this noise.
The Office Tropical Bird.
Oh, that's the one. Okay, one of the other things that we've got is we have a Morse code kit. It basically is the famous code consisting of dots and dashes that was invented by Mr. Morse and is still used, I believe, even today with shipping, etc. Let me give you a demonstration.
Let's hope you didn't signal anything rude then.
I hope not. I'm afraid my Morse code isn't up to much. Which allows her actually to transmit via satellite.
And we've got lots of other sort of interactive displays.
Yes, we're very keen on the interactive. You can have your picture taken with a spaceman. We don't introduce you, though. You can't date him. You can only have your picture taken with him. You can have a picture taken of your head, which then becomes a 3D head that you can manipulate on a computer screen, frowning and smiling, etc., etc. We've also got places up here where you can actually talk to someone at Land's End. We have a video phone here and various other interactive displays that you can get your hands on. We believe that people should be able to enjoy themselves and actually have a go themselves.
Despite, or rather because, of Cornwall's location at the nation's edge, it stands central to Britain's communications network.
70-80. Capital Gold Breakfast. Over the top.